world fade away as we step into the lingering shadows of the Hotel Cecil. Tonight, we unravel a century of mysteries hidden within America's most enigmatic address. It was a Tuesday morning in downtown Los Angeles when the guests at the Cecil Hotel realized something was terribly wrong with the water.
We unravel a century of mysteries hidden within America's most
When
enigmatic
people turned on their
address.
taps to brush their teeth, the water came out dark,
It was a Tuesday morning in
brownish-black.
downtown
It had
Los
a taste
Angeles
that one
when the
could
guests of the
describe
Cecil
as
Hotel
shadows.
realized something
They
was
had no
terribly
idea
wrong tonight
they had
with the
been
water. We
drinking.
unravel a
It started as a
century
drop
of
of
mysteries
pressure,
hidden
but
within
then the color
America's
changed. In late
most
January,
when people turned on their
dress,
taps to brush.
a 21-year-old student from Vancouver named Elisa Lam arrived in Los Angeles. She was a prolific blogger, a deep thinker, and she was currently in the middle of what she called her West Coast tour. This was supposed to be her big solo adventure, a way to see the world and document it all on her Tumblr blog, Etherfields. She was bright, she was curious, and to anyone looking at her from the outside, she was just another young tourist excited to see the sights of California. She eventually made her way to downtown LA and checked into the Cecil Hotel. Now, if you're a local, the name Cecil carries a very specific, dark weight. Built in the 1920s, it was once a grand destination, but over the decades, it had transformed into something much more sinister. It was located right on the edge of Skid Row, and it had become a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. This was a hotel where serial killers like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, used to stay while he was actively committing his crimes. It was a building with a history of suicides, unexplained violence, and a general atmosphere that many described as suffocating. But Elisa was on a budget, and the Cecil, which was rebranding part of its building as Stay on Main, seemed like a perfectly fine home base for her trip. For the first few days, everything was completely normal. She did exactly what you'd expect a tourist to do. She went to local bookstores, she bought gifts for her family, and most importantly, she called her parents every single day. She was incredibly close with them, and she knew they'd worry if they didn't hear her voice. That's why, on the morning of February 1st, the silence was so deafening. This was the day Elisa was supposed to check out of the Cecil and head north to Santa Cruz. Her parents sat by the phone in Vancouver, waiting for the check-in call that never came. They called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. They waited a few hours, thinking maybe she was just on a bus or her battery had died. But by that evening, they knew something was wrong. This wasn't Elisa. She didn't just disappear. They called the LAPD, and when officers arrived at the Cecil to check her room, they found a scene that made no sense. Elisa's room wasn't empty. Her suitcase was there. Her laptop was there. Even her prescription medication, which she needed to manage her health, was sitting right there on the table. It looked like she had just stepped out for 5 minutes and was planning to come right back. But as the police looked around the cluttered, aging hotel, they realized that Elisa Lam hadn't just missed her checkout. She had seemingly evaporated into the thick, smoggy air of downtown Los Angeles, leaving behind everything she owned and a mystery that was about to get much, much stranger. When the LAPD began their investigation, they were at a total standstill. There were no signs of a struggle in Elisa's room, no blood, and no evidence that anyone had forced their way in. They had searched the building with bloodhounds, but the dogs couldn't lock onto a scent. So, the detectives turned to the only witness they had left, the hotel's closed-circuit security cameras. They started scrubbing through hours of grainy, low-frame rate footage until they found a clip from the night Elisa vanished. It was from a camera tucked into the top corner of one of the hotel's elevators. When the detectives hit play, they expected to see a suspect, or perhaps Elisa being led away. Instead, they saw 4 minutes of the most baffling footage ever recorded. In the video, the elevator doors slide open and Elisa walks in. She's wearing a red hoodie, and she immediately leans over to the control panel. But instead of pressing one button, she presses a whole vertical column of them, one after another. She then retreats to the back corner of the elevator, standing perfectly still, as if she's waiting for the doors to close. But they don't. The doors stay wide open. Elisa looks confused. She tentatively steps toward the opening and peers out into the hallway. She does this jerky, unnatural movement where she sticks her head out, looks left, looks right, and then snaps back inside as if she's spotted someone or something stalking her in the corridor. She then cowers in the corner, pressing herself against the wall where she thinks she can't be seen from the hallway. A few seconds later, she steps back out into the hall. She begins to move her hands in a way that is truly disturbing to watch. Her fingers are splayed out, and she's waving her arms in these fluid, circular motions, almost like she's conducting an orchestra or trying to cast a spell. Her body is contorting in ways that don't look like a normal conversation. To the detectives watching, it looked like she was interacting with someone standing just inches away from her, but the camera shows absolutely no one else in that hallway. Finally, after nearly 3 minutes of this, Elisa walks out of the frame and disappears into the darkness of the 14th floor corridor. Moments later, for no apparent reason, the elevator doors finally slide shut and the lift moves on to another floor, perfectly functional. When the LAPD released this footage to the public, they were hoping for a tip. What they got was a global obsession. Millions of people began dissecting the video frame by frame. Some people pointed out that the footage looked edited, noting that the timestamp was blurred out and that the video seemed slowed down in certain parts. The internet became a breeding ground for theories. Was she being hunted by a professional who knew how to avoid the cameras? Was this a secret government experiment? Or, given the Cecil's dark history, was she being tormented by something supernatural? The video didn't provide any answers. It only deepened the dread. Because while the world was debating what they saw in that elevator, Elisa was still missing. And the secret of her location was hidden in a place much darker than a hallway. While the internet was busy turning the elevator footage into a viral ghost story, the living residents of the Cecil Hotel were dealing with a nightmare of their own. For weeks after Elisa's disappearance, the hotel guests began to notice that their stay was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but they couldn't quite put their finger on why. It started with the water pressure. It was incredibly low, barely a trickle coming out of the shower heads and the sinks. But as the days passed, it wasn't just the pressure that was the problem. It was the water itself. One guest, Sabrina Baugh, who was visiting from the UK, described a scene that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a horror movie. She said that when she turned on the tap to brush her teeth, the water would come out clear for a second, but then it would turn into this dark, brownish-black sludge. It was oily, it was opaque, and when she finally got the courage to take a shower, she said the water felt slippery on her skin in a way that didn't feel like soap. But the most chilling detail was the taste. Guests began complaining to the front desk that the drinking water had a funny quality to it. They described it as having a very unusual, bittersweet taste. It was a flavor that was both metallic and rotten at the same time. Yet, because the Cecil was a budget hotel in a rough part of town, many of the guests just assumed it was old pipes or the city's poor plumbing. For 19 days, they continued to drink that water. They used it to make their coffee. They gargled with it. They soaked in it. By February 19th, the complaints had reached a breaking point. The hotel management realized they couldn't ignore the black water anymore. They called one of their maintenance workers, Santiago Lopez, and told him he needed to go up to the roof to check the main water supply. Now, the roof of the Cecil is not a place where guests are allowed to go. To get there, Lopez had to take the elevator to the 15th floor, walk up a staircase, and pass through a door that was equipped with a heavy-duty alarm system. If anyone unauthorized opened that door, an alarm would scream through the hotel and alert the front desk immediately. Lopez stepped out onto the roof, which was crowded with ventilation ducts and machinery. Tucked away at the back were 4 massive 1,000-gallon steel water tanks. These tanks were 10 feet tall and sat on raised concrete blocks. There were no fixed ladders leading to the top of them, as Lopez climbed a portable ladder to inspect the main tank, the one that supplied the hotel's drinking and bathing water. He noticed something that stopped him cold. The heavy steel hatch on top of the tank was standing wide open. He climbed the final few rungs, reached the top of the tank, and peered down into the dark, still water. At first, he couldn't see anything, but as his eyes adjusted to the shadows inside the cistern, he saw a pale shape drifting near the bottom. It was Elisa Lam. She was floating face up, her body badly decomposed after nearly 3 weeks in the water. She was completely nude. Her clothes, the red hoodie, the black shorts, and her room key were also in the tank, settled at the bottom as if they had been thrown in separately or taken off once she was already inside. The realization hit the hotel like a physical blow. For nearly 3 weeks, the hotel's main water supply had been contaminated by what no one yet knew was Elisa's body. The discovery of Elisa's body didn't bring the closure the LAPD was hoping for. Instead, it opened up a rabbit hole of physical impossibilities that seemed to defy every law of logic. When the news broke that a body had been found inside a sealed water tank on a locked roof, the public began asking the same question the detectives were. How? You have to understand the layout of the Cecil's roof to realize why this was so baffling. First, there was the issue of how restricted the roof was. There were only 2 ways onto that roof. One was a fire escape on the side of the building, which would have been nearly impossible to climb without being spotted from the street. The other was a door on the 15th floor that was heavily alarmed. The hotel staff testified that if that door was opened, an alarm would sound at the front desk and in the manager's office. On the night Elisa disappeared, that alarm never made a sound. But let's say, for a moment, that she found a way past the alarms. She then would have stepped out onto a roof in the middle of a pitch-black Los Angeles night. Ahead of her were 4 massive 1,000-gallon steel cisterns. These weren't small containers. They were towering structures, 10 feet tall, sitting on high concrete pedestals. There were no stairs. There were no permanent ladders. To get to the top, Elisa, who was only about 5 feet 4 inches and barely 120 pounds, would have had to somehow scale the smooth, vertical side of a steel tank while carrying her clothes or being completely naked. Even for an athlete, that's a difficult climb. For a young woman in the middle of a mental health crisis, it's extremely difficult and dangerous. And then, there was the hatch mystery. For years, the narrative pushed by the media and the internet was that the heavy steel hatch on top of the tank was closed and locked from the outside when she was found. This was the smoking gun for conspiracy theorists. They argued that if she had jumped in herself, there was no physical way she could have pulled that heavy lid shut from the inside. It weighed enough that it took effort for a grown man to lift it. This led people to believe she was murdered, that someone had killed her, carried her to the roof, dumped her in, and sealed the tomb behind them. But there's a detail that often gets left out of the viral stories. The maintenance worker, Santiago Lopez, would later clarify in his official testimony that when he first reached the top of that tank, the hatch was actually already open. The idea that it was closed was a mistake in the initial reporting that took on a life of its own. Yet, even with an open hatch, the logistics were haunting. Why would she take her clothes off? Why would she throw them into the water with her? The coroner found no signs of sexual assault, no trauma, and no struggle. It looked as though she had simply climbed into the dark, cold water of her own accord. But as the investigation shifted from a whodunit to a why, the focus returned to that strange footage in the elevator and the secret Elisa was carrying in her backpack. After months of global speculation and wild theories about paranormal dimensions and government cover-ups, the Los Angeles County Coroner finally released the autopsy report. The findings were not what the internet expected. There were no strange chemicals in her system, no signs of foul play, and no evidence that she had been attacked. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, with a significant contributing factor, bipolar I disorder, a serious mood disorder. When investigators searched Elisa's belongings back in her hotel room, they found her prescription medications. But when they counted the pills, the math didn't add up. It appeared that Elisa had not been taking her stabilizing medication as prescribed. For someone with her condition, stopping those medications can trigger what's known as a manic episode or a psychotic break. If you go back and watch that elevator footage with this in mind, the paranormal behavior suddenly looks very different. The hiding in the corner, the frantic pressing of buttons, and the strange waving of her hands. These are all tragic, textbook signs of someone experiencing severe hallucinations and paranoia. In her mind, she wasn't playing a game. She was likely fleeing from a threat that didn't exist, a shadow that only she could see. The most heartbreaking theory of how she ended up in the tank is also the most realistic. In the middle of a terrifying psychotic break, Elisa likely felt she needed to find the ultimate hiding spot. She made her way to the roof, possibly via the fire escape to avoid the alarm door, and saw those massive tanks. She climbed up, saw the water as a place of safety or a way to cool down, and slipped inside. Once she was in the water, she would have realized her mistake almost instantly. The water was cold, and the walls of the tank were smooth, vertical steel. There was nothing to grab onto. As hypothermia began to set in, many victims experienced something called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where the brain, in its final moments of confusion, makes the person feel like they're burning up, causing them to strip off their clothes, even in freezing conditions. This would explain why she was found nude, with her clothes floating beside her. Elisa Lam wasn't a victim of the Cecil Hotel's dark history or a supernatural entity. She was a young woman who was thousands of miles from home, fighting a battle inside her own mind that she eventually lost. While the elevator video remains a staple of creepy internet lore, the real story is much more somber. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things we face aren't hiding in the shadows of a hallway. They're the ones that follow us wherever we go. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, there is help and support available. In the mid-1980s, Los Angeles felt like a city under siege. Every evening, the news was dominated by the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, a man who broke into suburban homes and left terror in his wake. The police response was massive, and the media coverage never stopped. But while the world's eyes were on the glittering neighborhoods, a quieter, colder predator was stalking the shadows of South Central. Patient, calculating, and far more sinister than anyone realized. Between 1985 and 1988, a terrifying pattern began to emerge in the 77th Street Division of the LAPD. It started with the discovery of a young woman's body discarded in an alleyway, hidden behind a dumpster. She had been shot once in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun. There was no struggle, no robbery, and no obvious motive. Then, a few months later, it happened again. Same caliber, same disposal method, same neighborhood. The detectives on the case realized they were looking at a serial predator, but the investigation was struggling. The killer wasn't breaking into houses or leaving behind elaborate signatures like Ramirez. He was picking up women in his car, women who were often in vulnerable positions, and then he was disposing of them like trash in the early hours of the morning. Because these victims were from a part of the city that was already struggling with high crime rates, the South Central Slayer, as he was then called, didn't get the same national headlines. He was a ghost moving through the smog. Then, in 1988, after claiming at least 7 victims, the killer did something that almost never happens in the world of criminal psychology. He stopped. For an entire year, there were no more .25 caliber shootings. Then 2 years passed. Then 5. Then a decade. The detectives who had worked the original files retired. The evidence boxes were moved to the back of the archives, gathering dust. In the criminal world, the consensus was that the killer was gone. Maybe he had died in a street fight. Maybe he had been locked up for something else. Or maybe he had moved to another state to start over. Because of this unprecedented 13-year gap in activity, the media eventually gave him a new, chilling nickname, the Grim Sleeper. They believed he had simply gone to sleep. But in 2002, the nap ended. A young woman was found in an alley in South Central. And when the ballistics report came back, the veteran technicians at the lab couldn't believe what they were seeing. The markings on the bullet matched a series of unsolved murders from 1985. The sleeper hadn't died, and he hadn't moved away. For 13 years, while the city changed, while the 90s came and went, and while a new century began, this man had been living right there in the neighborhood. He had been walking the same streets and breathing the same air as the people searching for him. The realization was terrifying. No one knew why the murders had stopped. The mystery of those missing years is what makes this case so haunting. It showed detectives that the person they were looking for could blend into ordinary life. He was someone with a stable life, someone who could blend into the background so completely that no one suspected him. He wasn't a ghost. He was a neighbor. And as the investigation restarted in 2002, the LAPD realized they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a man who had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight. While the LAPD was digitizing old files and realizing the Grim Sleeper was back on the hunt, the man behind the moniker was living a life that was almost aggressively ordinary. If you had driven down 81st Street in South Los Angeles during the 1990s or early 2000s, you would have seen a man named Lonnie Franklin Jr. He was a fixture of the block. He was a former garbage collector for the city and had once worked as a garage attendant for the LAPD itself. To the people on his street, Lonnie wasn't a figure to be feared. He was the man you went to when you were in trouble. He was the neighborhood mechanic. Lonnie's front yard and garage were always filled with cars in various states of repair. He was a gearhead who could fix a transmission or a busted alternator for a fraction of what a professional shop would charge. Because of this, he had a constant stream of people coming and going from his property. Neighbors remembered him as a friendly, helpful guy who would host backyard barbecues, hand out cold drinks on hot days, and look out for the neighborhood kids. He was a husband and a father. He was, by all outward appearances, the good neighbor everyone wants on their street. But this helpful mechanic persona was the ultimate camouflage. The very things that made Lonnie popular in the neighborhood were the things that allowed him to commit his crimes. His obsession with cars gave him a reason to be out at all hours of the night. It gave him a reason to have a rotating fleet of different vehicles, making it impossible for witnesses to pin down a specific car associated with crimes. And most chillingly, his reputation for helping people meant that when he pulled up next to a woman at 2 a.m., he didn't look like a predator. He looked like the guy from down the street. He looked safe. What the neighbors didn't see was what was happening behind the closed doors of that cluttered garage. While Lonnie was fixing engines for his friends, he was also maintaining a secret history of his violence. When the police eventually breached his home, they didn't just find tools and car parts. They found a chamber of horrors hidden in plain sight. Inside the house, detectives discovered a massive collection of photographs and home movies. There were over 1,000 photos of women, many of them looking unconscious or trapped. These weren't just snapshots, they were trophies. Lonnie had been documenting his victims for over 20 years. He had kept their IDs, their jewelry, and their images stored away in a meticulously organized library of his own cruelty. This is the part of the Grim Sleeper story that is the most difficult to process. For over 2 decades, Lonnie Franklin Jr. sat on his porch and waved at police cruisers as they drove by. He attended community meetings. He talked about the rising crime rates with his neighbors. He played the part of a concerned citizen perfectly, all while the evidence of his crimes was tucked away in his bedroom, just a few feet from where he slept with his wife. The sleep that gave him his nickname became one of the strangest gaps in the investigation. What happened during those 13 years remains one of the biggest mysteries of the case. When the murders began again, detectives noticed changes in his patterns and methods. Lonnie Franklin Jr. wasn't a monster hiding in the woods or a ghost in a haunted hotel. He was the man who fixed your car. He was the man who offered you a burger at Cookout. He was the proof that the most terrifying predators don't look like the ones in the movies. They look like the person living right next door, waiting for the sun to go down so they can step back into the shadows. By 2010, the LAPD was desperate. They knew the Grim Sleeper was still out there, and they knew he was living somewhere in a specific corridor of South Los Angeles. They had his DNA from multiple crime scenes, but it was a ghost profile. It didn't match anyone in the state or federal databases, which meant the killer had managed to avoid a felony arrest for his entire life. He was a clean citizen on paper, but then the investigation turned to a brand new, controversial forensic technique called familial DNA searching. Instead of looking for a perfect 1:1 match, the lab started looking for a partial match, someone who shared enough genetic markers to be a brother, a father, or a son of the killer. They ran the profile again, and suddenly, the computer screen lit up. They had a hit. A young man named Christopher Franklin had recently been arrested on a weapons charge, and his DNA was in the system. He wasn't the killer. The math didn't add up for his age, but the DNA proved he was the biological son of the man who had been terrorizing Los Angeles since 1985. The detectives looked into Christopher's family tree, and there he was, Lonnie Franklin Jr. The police didn't have enough for an arrest warrant yet. They needed Lonnie's actual DNA to close the loop. But they couldn't just walk up and ask him for a swab. They had to be surgical. They began a 24-hour surveillance operation, following the 57-year-old mechanic as he went about his normal day. For days, they watched him, waiting for him to spit on the sidewalk or throw away a coffee cup. But Lonnie was careful. It was as if he knew that even a single discarded item could end his life of freedom. Then, on July 7, 2010, Lonnie drove to a local pizza parlor for a birthday party. An undercover officer, dressed as a waiter, was already inside, briefed and ready. He spent the evening clearing plates, refilling drinks, and acting completely invisible. Just another worker in a busy restaurant. He watched Lonnie like a hawk. He watched him eat, watched him drink, and waited for the moment Lonnie pushed his plate away. As soon as Lonnie Franklin Jr. stood up and walked out of that restaurant, the waiter moved in. He didn't just clear the table. He treated that table like a high-stakes crime scene. He carefully bagged a partially eaten pizza crust, a used napkin, a plastic fork, and a paper cup. These weren't scraps of trash anymore. They were the keys to a 25-year-old mystery. The items were rushed to the lab under emergency status. The technicians worked through the night, extracting the saliva from the crust and the cup. When the results flashed on the monitor, the room went silent. It was a perfect 100% match to the DNA found on the victims of the Grim Sleeper. The next morning, a fleet of black SUVs swarmed Lonnie's house on 81st Street. The neighbors came out onto their porches, confused, watching as the friendly neighborhood mechanic was let out in handcuffs. They couldn't believe it. They shouted at the police, telling them they had the wrong guy, that Lonnie was a good man. But as the investigators began to pull the trophies out of Lonnie's house, the hundreds of photos, the Polaroids, and the personal items of missing women, the neighborhood fell silent. The man who'd been fixing their cars and hosting their barbecues was revealed to be one of the most disturbing serial predators in Los Angeles history. Whether he was truly sleeping or simply went undetected is something no one will ever know. When the handcuffs clicked shut on Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s wrists on that July morning in 2010, the LAPD thought the hardest part of the job was over. They had the DNA. They had the man. But as they stepped across the threshold of his home on 81st Street, they realized the nightmare was much larger than the 10 murders they had originally linked to the Grim Sleeper. Inside the house, it wasn't just cluttered. It was a museum of human suffering. In a hidden crawl space and tucked away in the rafters of his garage, detectives found a literal library of the missing. There were over 1,000 photographs and hundreds of hours of video footage. Most of the women in these photos were alive, but they looked dazed, unconscious, or terrified. Many were posed in ways that suggested they had no idea they were being photographed. The police were faced with a haunting realization. Lonnie Franklin hadn't just killed 10 women. He had photographed and encountered hundreds of women whose identities were never known. The Sleeper nickname became even more haunting because it reflected how long he went undetected. Maybe he had died in a street fight. Maybe he had been locked up for something else. Or maybe he had moved to another state to start over. Because of this unprecedented 13-year gap in activity, the media eventually gave him a new, chilling nickname, the Grim Sleeper. They believed he had simply gone to sleep. But in 2002, the nap ended. A young woman was found in an alley in South Central. And when the ballistics report came back, the veteran technicians at the lab couldn't believe what they were seeing. The markings on the bullet matched a series of unsolved murders from 1985. The Sleeper hadn't died, and he hadn't moved away. For 13 years, while the city changed, while the 90s came and went, and while a new century began, this man had been living right there in the neighborhood. He had been walking the same streets and breathing the same air as the people searching for him. The realization was terrifying. No one knew why the murders had stopped. The mystery of those missing years is what makes this case so haunting. It showed detectives that the person they were looking for could blend into ordinary life. He was someone with a stable life, someone who could blend into the background so completely that no one suspected him. He wasn't a ghost. He was a neighbor. And as the investigation restarted in 2002, the LAPD realized they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a man who had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight. While the LAPD was digitizing old files and realizing the grim sleeper was back on the hunt, the man behind the moniker was living a life that was almost aggressively ordinary. If you had driven down 81st Street in South Los Angeles during the 1990s or early 2000s, you would have seen a man named Lonnie Franklin Jr. He was a fixture of the block. He was a former garbage collector for the city and had once worked as a garage attendant for the LAPD itself. To the people on his street, Lonnie wasn't a figure to be feared. He was the man you went to when you were in trouble. He was the neighborhood mechanic. Lonnie's front yard and garage were always filled with cars in various states of repair. He was a gearhead who could fix a transmission or a busted alternator for a fraction of what a professional shop would charge. Because of this, he had a constant stream of people coming and going from his property. Neighbors remembered him as a friendly, helpful guy who would host backyard barbecues, hand out cold drinks on hot days, and look out for the neighborhood kids. He was a husband and a father. He was, by all outward appearances, the good neighbor everyone wants on their street. But this helpful mechanic persona was the ultimate camouflage. The very things that made Lonnie popular in the neighborhood were the things that allowed him to commit his crimes. His obsession with cars gave him a reason to be out at all hours of the night. It gave him a reason to have a rotating fleet of different vehicles, making it impossible for witnesses to pin down a specific car associated with crimes. And most chillingly, his reputation for helping people meant that when he pulled up next to a woman at 2 a.m., he didn't look like a predator. He looked like the guy from down the street. He looked safe. What the neighbors didn't see was what was happening behind the closed doors of that cluttered garage. While Lonnie was fixing engines for his friends, he was also maintaining a secret history of his violence. When the police eventually breached his home, they didn't just find tools and car parts. They found a chamber of horrors hidden in plain sight. Inside the house, detectives discovered a massive collection of photographs and home movies. There were over 1,000 photos of women, many of them looking unconscious or trapped. These weren't just snapshots, they were trophies. Lonnie had been documenting his victims for over 20 years. He had kept their IDs, their jewelry, and their images stored away in a meticulously organized library of his own cruelty. This is the part of the grim sleeper story that is the most difficult to process. For over 2 decades, Lonnie Franklin Jr. sat on his porch and waved at police cruisers as they drove by. He attended community meetings. He talked about the rising crime rates with his neighbors. He played the part of a concerned citizen perfectly, all while the evidence of his crimes was tucked away in his bedroom just a few feet from where he slept with his wife. The sleep that gave him his nickname became one of the strangest gaps in the investigation. What happened during those 13 years remains one of the biggest mysteries of the case. When the murders began again, detectives noticed changes in his patterns and methods. Lonnie Franklin Jr. wasn't a monster hiding in the woods or a ghost in a haunted hotel. He was the man who fixed your car. He was the man who offered you a burger at Cookout. He was the proof that the most terrifying predators don't look like the ones in the movies. They look like the person living right next door, waiting for the sun to go down so they can step back into the shadows. By 2010, the LAPD was desperate. They knew the grim sleeper was still out there, and they knew he was living somewhere in a specific corridor of South Los Angeles. They had his DNA from multiple crime scenes, but it was a ghost profile. It didn't match anyone in the state or federal databases, which meant the killer had managed to avoid a felony arrest for his entire life. He was a clean citizen on paper. But then, the investigation turned to a brand new, controversial forensic technique called familial DNA searching. Instead of looking for a perfect 1:1 match, the lab started looking for a partial match, someone who shared enough genetic markers to be a brother, a father, or a son of the killer. They ran the profile again, and suddenly, the computer screen lit up. They had a hit. A young man named Christopher Franklin had recently been arrested on a weapons charge, and his DNA was in the system. He wasn't the killer. The math didn't add up for his age, but the DNA proved he was the biological son of the man who had been terrorizing Los Angeles since 1985. The detectives looked into Christopher's family tree, and there he was, Lonnie Franklin Jr. The police didn't have enough for an arrest warrant yet. They needed Lonnie's actual DNA to close the loop. But they couldn't just walk up and ask him for a swab. They had to be surgical. They began a 24-hour surveillance operation, following the 57-year-old mechanic as he went about his normal day. For days, they watched him, waiting for him to spit on the sidewalk or throw away a coffee cup. But Lonnie was careful. It was as if he knew that even a single discarded item could end his life of freedom. Then, on July 7, 2010, Lonnie drove to a local pizza parlor for a birthday party. An undercover officer, dressed as a waiter, was already inside, briefed and ready. He spent the evening clearing plates, refilling drinks, and acting completely invisible. Just another worker in a busy restaurant. He watched Lonnie like a hawk. He watched him eat, watched him drink, and waited for the moment Lonnie pushed his plate away. As soon as Lonnie Franklin Jr. stood up and walked out of that restaurant, the waiter moved in. He didn't just clear the table. He treated that table like a high-stakes crime scene. He carefully bagged a partially eaten pizza crust, a used napkin, a plastic fork, and a paper cup. These weren't scraps of trash anymore. They were the keys to a 25-year-old mystery. The items were rushed to the lab under emergency status. The technicians worked through the night, extracting the saliva from the crust and the cup. When the results flashed on the monitor, the room went silent. It was a perfect 100% match to the DNA found on the victims of the Grim Sleeper. The next morning, a fleet of black SUVs swarmed Lonnie's house on 81st Street. The neighbors came out onto their porches, confused, watching as the friendly neighborhood mechanic was let out in handcuffs. They couldn't believe it. They shouted at the police, telling them they had the wrong guy, that Lonnie was a good man. But as the investigators began to pull the trophies out of Lonnie's house, the hundreds of photos, the Polaroids, and the personal items of missing women, the neighborhood fell silent. The man who had been fixing their cars and hosting their barbecues was revealed to be one of the most disturbing serial predators in Los Angeles history. Whether he was truly sleeping or simply went undetected is something no one will ever know. When the handcuffs clicked shut on Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s wrists on that July morning in 2010, the LAPD thought the hardest part of the job was over. They had the DNA. They had the man. But as they stepped across the threshold of his home on 81st Street, they realized the nightmare was much larger than the 10 murders they had originally linked to the Grim Sleeper. Inside the house, it wasn't just cluttered. It was a museum of human suffering. In a hidden crawlspace and tucked away in the rafters of his garage, detectives found a literal library of the missing. There were over 1,000 photographs and hundreds of hours of video footage. Most of the women in these photos were alive, but they looked dazed, unconscious, or terrified. Many were posed in ways that suggested they had no idea they were being photographed. The police were faced with a haunting realization. Lonnie Franklin hadn't just killed 10 women. He had photographed and encountered hundreds of women whose identities were never known. The Sleeper nickname became even more haunting because it reflected how long he went undetected. The trial, which didn't begin until 2016, was one of the most emotional in the history of the Los Angeles Superior Court. For years, the families of the victims have been told their loved ones' cases were unsolvable or low priority. Now, they were sitting in a courtroom just feet away from the man who had treated their daughters, sisters, and mothers like disposable trash. Lonnie Franklin sat there the entire time with a blank, almost bored expression. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a retired grandfather in a cardigan. But then, the prosecution brought out the final photo. During the search of Lonnie's house, they had found a photo of a young woman named Janisha Peters, who was the victim that woke up the Sleeper in 2007. The photo showed her in the back of Lonnie's car, looking directly into the camera. It was a haunting, silent plea for help from the past. When that photo was displayed on the large monitors in the courtroom, the reality of Lonnie's hobby became undeniable. He wasn't just a killer. He was a voyeur who feasted on the fear of his victims. In May 2016, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was sentenced to death, but much like Richard Ramirez, he would never make it to the execution chamber. In March 2020, at the age of 67, Lonnie was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. The man who had spent 3 decades hiding in the shadows of South Central, playing the part of the helpful neighbor, finally ran out of time. The legacy of the Grim Sleeper isn't just about the DNA or the pizza crust sting. It's a story about the invisible victims of Los Angeles. It's a reminder that a predator can operate for 30 years right under the nose of the police, as long as he chooses his targets from the parts of society that the world chooses not to see. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s crimes thrived in the silence of a city that wasn't paying attention. Today, the 81st Street house is gone, but the families of his victims finally have the one thing Lonnie tried to take from them: the truth. After Lonnie was behind bars, the LAPD was left with a massive, terrifying archive: those 1,000 photographs found in his home. Most of the women in the pictures weren't the 10 victims from the trial. They were faces the police didn't recognize. There were women smiling, women sleeping, and women who looked like they were in the middle of a nightmare. In an unprecedented move, the LAPD decided to release 180 of these photos to the public. They set up a website, essentially asking the world, "Do you know these women? Are they still alive?" The response was a wave of both relief and horror. Families across California logged on, scrolling through the gallery of the Sleeper's private collection. Some families found their sisters or daughters and realized they were alive. They had encountered Lonnie, survived, and moved on, never knowing they had been in the company of a serial killer. But for others, the website confirmed their worst fears. They saw the face of a loved one who had been missing for 20 years, realizing that her last known connection may have been that cluttered garage on 81st Street. This brings us to the true weight of the Grim Sleeper's legacy. Lonnie Franklin didn't just kill people. He stole their stories and their dignity. Because he operated during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s, he knew that if a woman went missing in South Central, the authorities might just categorize her as another runaway or a casualty of the streets. He weaponized the world's indifference. Even though Lonnie died in San Quentin in 2020, the investigation into his life continues in the shadows. To this day, there are dozens of women from those photographs who have never been identified. They remain the missing, their fates tied to a man who took his secrets to the grave. The story of the Grim Sleeper is a sobering reminder that a monster doesn't always need a hideout or a disguise to survive. Sometimes, all he needs is a quiet street, a set of mechanics tools, and a neighborhood that the rest of the world has decided not to watch. Lonnie Franklin Jr. taught the city of Los Angeles a hard lesson. The most dangerous person isn't the one you're afraid of. It's the one you've stopped noticing. This next case takes us back to the same location where we started, the Cecil Hotel, but the year is 1985. During this time, Los Angeles was gripped by a heat wave that seemed to drive the city into a state of madness. People were sleeping with their windows wide open just to catch a breeze, unaware that a monster was stalking the pavement. This is the story of the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Imagine it's 3 a.m. You're in your home in a quiet LA suburb. It's sweltering hot, so you've left the window cracked. You fall asleep to the sound of a box fan humming. Suddenly, you wake up. There's no noise, but you feel a presence. You look toward the foot of your bed, and standing there is a tall, skeletal figure dressed entirely in black. He's wearing an oversized jacket, and his eyes are wide, dark, and filled with a terrifying sort of energy. This was the reality for dozens of victims during the summer of fear. Richard Ramirez wasn't like other serial killers who had a specific type or a predictable pattern. He was a chaotic force. He attacked the elderly, young couples, and children. He used handguns, knives, and even tire irons. Because his methods changed every time, the LAPD was chasing a ghost. But what makes this even more disturbing is where he went to relax after committing these atrocities. In 1985, The city of Los Angeles was paralyzed by a heat wave that seemed to bring out the absolute worst in the human psyche. People were terrified. Gun sales were through the roof, and homeowners were spending thousands of dollars to install bars on their windows. Everyone was looking over their shoulder, waiting for the Night Stalker to emerge from the shadows. But while the entire LAPD was scouring the suburbs, the monster they were looking for was sitting in a $14 a night room at the Cecil Hotel, right in the heart of downtown. Richard Ramirez didn't look like a master criminal. He was a gaunt, disheveled 25-year-old with rotting teeth and a heavy scent of body odor and tobacco. In any other part of the world, he would have stood out like a sore thumb. But the Cecil Hotel in the mid-'80s wasn't like the rest of the world. It was a place where society's forgotten people ended up. The lobby was a revolving door of drifters, addicts, and people just trying to survive until morning. In a place that chaotic, Richard Ramirez didn't look like a serial killer. He just looked like another resident. Think about the sheer audacity of his routine. Ramirez would wait until the sun went down, step out of the Cecil, and get into a stolen car. He would drive for miles, sometimes out to the quiet, affluent suburbs of the San Gabriel Valley. He would find a house with an unlocked window, creep inside, and commit acts of such extreme violence they were almost beyond description. But it's what he did after the crimes that is truly hard to believe. After hours of being inside a victim's home, Ramirez would be covered in physical evidence. His clothes would be stained, his hands would be marked, and he would be carrying jewelry or electronics stolen from the house. He would drive back into the gritty, neon-lit streets of downtown LA, park the car, and walk right through the front doors of the Cecil. He would pass the night clerk at the front desk, who was often too tired or too used to the madness to even look up. Ramirez would step into that same old, creaky elevator, the same one Elisa Lam would be seen in decades later, and ride it up to the 14th floor. Because the Cecil was a single-room occupancy hotel, the rooms didn't have private bathrooms. They had shared, communal bathrooms at the end of the hallways. Multiple witnesses who lived on the 14th floor during that summer later told police about a terrifying sight they saw on a regular basis. They would step out of their rooms to use the restroom in the middle of the night and see a tall, skeletal man walking down the hall. Ramirez would be stripped down to his underwear, carrying the clothes he had worn that night in a bundle. He would walk calmly into the communal shower area to wash the evidence of his crimes down the drain. In a normal hotel, seeing a man covered in blood in the hallway would result in an immediate 911 call and a SWAT team response. But this was the Cecil. The people living there had seen it all. They assumed he'd been in a street fight or a mugging, which were daily occurrences on Skid Row. They simply looked the other way, went back into their rooms, and locked their doors. This went on for months. Ramirez was effectively using the Cecil as a safe house, hiding in the one place where strange was the baseline. He was living in a room full of stolen loot and blood-stained rags, while just floors away, families were sleeping and tourists were checking in. He was a predator hiding in a den of ghosts, and if it hadn't been for a single fingerprint left on a stolen car, he might have stayed in room 1402 forever, disappearing into the thick, smoggy air of Main Street every night to find his next victim. By late August 1985, the tension in Los Angeles had reached a fever pitch. The Night Stalker was no longer just a headline. He was a boogeyman that had successfully shut down the nightlife of an entire city. But while the police were drowning in thousands of dead-end tips, a massive breakthrough finally happened. Detectives processed a stolen orange Toyota and found a single, clean fingerprint on the rearview mirror. They ran it through the system, and for the first time, the ghost had a name, Richard Ramirez. On the morning of August 31st, the LAPD did something unprecedented. They released his mugshot to every news outlet simultaneously. But there was a catch. Ramirez wasn't in his room at the Cecil that morning. He had actually taken a bus out of town to visit his brother in Arizona. Because he was traveling, he hadn't seen a TV. He hadn't heard a radio. He had no idea that while he was sitting on a Greyhound bus heading back into Los Angeles, his face was the only thing being talked about in the entire state of California. When he stepped off the bus at the terminal in East LA, He was wearing a purple Jack Daniels t-shirt and his signature dark sunglasses. He walked into a small convenience store on Olympic Boulevard, looking for a snack. As he stood at the counter, he noticed the cashier wasn't looking at the money in his hand. She was looking at his face. Her eyes were wide with pure terror. Ramirez looked down at a stack of newspapers sitting on the rack next to him. Right there on the front page of the Los Angeles Times was his own face staring back at him in high definition. The headline was screaming his name. Ramirez didn't say a word. He turned and bolted out of the store. He ran across the lanes of the Santa Ana freeway, dodging cars, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey. He sprinted into a residential neighborhood in East Los Angeles, desperate to find a getaway car. He saw a woman, Faustino Pina, sitting in her car, and he lunged at her, trying to pull her out. But this is where the story takes a turn that nobody, especially not Ramirez, expected. In any other neighborhood, people might have stayed inside and called the police. But this was East LA. The residents there were tight-knit, and they had been living in fear of this monster, just like everyone else. When they heard the woman's screams and saw a tall, gaunt man in a purple shirt trying to hijack a car, they didn't run away. A group of local men, led by a man named Manuel de la Torre, saw him. Manuel recognized the face from the morning news immediately. He yelled out, "El Matador," the killer. Within seconds, a dozen neighbors were out of their houses. They didn't have badges or guns, but they had had enough. Ramirez tried to run, but he was exhausted from the heat and the adrenaline. The group of citizens chased him down the block, cornering him near a fence. One of the men was wielding a long steel pipe. As Ramirez turned to face them, the crowd closed in. They rushed him and dragged him to the ground, fueled by months of pent-up terror and anger. When the first LAPD patrol car finally screeched to a halt at the scene, the officers didn't have to go on a high-speed chase. They found Richard Ramirez curled in a fetal position on the pavement, bleeding and bruised, literally begging the police to arrest him so the crowd wouldn't kill him. The Night Stalker, the man who had built a dark, theatrical persona around himself and tormented millions, had been taken down not by a task force, but by ordinary people. Had been taken down not by a sophisticated task force, but by a group of neighbors who decided that the summer of fear ended that day. As the police threw him into the back of the cruiser, the residents of East LA stood on their porches and cheered. The shadow over the Cecil Hotel and the rest of the city had finally been lifted. After the sirens faded and the Night Stalker was safely behind bars, the city of Los Angeles let out a collective breath it had been holding for over a year. But as the investigation shifted into the courtroom, the story didn't get any less strange. In fact, the trial of Richard Ramirez would become one of the most bizarre and dark spectacles in the history of the American justice system. When Ramirez walked into that courtroom, he didn't look like a man who was afraid of the death penalty. He looked like a man who was enjoying his newfound celebrity. He had gained weight, his hair was slicked back, and he leaned into the satanic persona the media had built for him. During one of his first appearances, he famously held up his palm to the cameras. He had drawn a pentagram on it in ink and yelled out a tribute to the darkness. But what really shocked the public wasn't the behavior of the killer. It was the behavior of the groupies. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes that involved the elderly and the innocent, Ramirez began receiving hundreds of letters at the jail every week. Most of them were from women who claimed they were in love with him. They would show up to the trial dressed in black, sitting in the gallery just to catch a glimpse of him. One woman, a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Leoe, began a relentless campaign to prove his innocence. She eventually married him while he was on death row in San Quentin. To the rest of the world, it was incomprehensible, but for Ramirez, it was the ultimate final taunt to his victims. He had spent his life as an outcast of the Cecil Hotel, and now he was a dark icon. The trial lasted for over a year, involving more than 160 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts, including 13 murders, Ramirez remained cold and detached. As he was being led out of the courtroom to face his sentencing, he turned to the reporters and uttered his final famous line, big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland. Richard Ramirez was sent to San Quentin's death row, where he would spend the next 23 years. But in a strange twist of fate, the man who had caused so much violent death didn't die by execution. In 2013, the very same year that Elisa Lam would be found in the water tank at the Cecil Hotel, Ramirez died in a hospital bed from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. The legacy of a Night Stalker remains a permanent scar on the geography of California. He was the reason people started locking their doors. He was the reason the security industry exploded in the 1980s. And he remains the most terrifying example of why the Cecil Hotel is viewed as a magnet for the macabre. Whether it was the 1940s with the Black Dahlia, the 1980s with Ramirez, or the 2010s with Elisa Lam, that one building in downtown LA has acted as a silent witness to some of the darkest chapters of the human experience. It's a place where the walls truly do talk, and the stories they tell are the ones we can never quite forget. After Ramirez was sent to San Quentin, the Cecil Hotel tried to move on. They repainted the hallways, changed the furniture, and tried to scrub away the reputation of the Night Stalker's safe house. But the hotel couldn't escape its own nature. In a twist that sounds like a Hollywood script, but is 100% real, just a few years after Ramirez's crimes ended, another international serial killer checked into the Cecil. His name was Jack Unterweger, a journalist from Austria who was actually in LA to write a story about the city's crime. He specifically requested a room at the Cecil because he wanted to stay where the Night Stalker stayed. While he was there, he used the hotel as a base to commit 3 more murders. It was as if the building itself was a beacon for a very specific kind of darkness. This brings the story full circle back to where we started, Elisa Lam. When Elisa's body was found in 2013, the internet went into a frenzy looking for connections to the hotel's past. They found a series of coincidences that are almost too strange to believe. The proximity. Ramirez lived on the 14th floor. Elisa was last seen in the elevator, just floors away from where the Night Stalker once used the communal bathrooms, in the communal sinks. The case of a Night Stalker changed the way we live. If you look at houses built before 1985, they often have thin, easy-to-slide windows and minimal security. Houses built after the summer of fear look like fortresses. We stopped being a society that left our doors unlocked for neighbors, and we became a society that looked at every stranger with suspicion. Richard Ramirez died in 2013, the same year Elisa Lam was found. He never showed remorse, and he never explained why he chose the Cecil. But his story serves as the ultimate warning. It tells us that the most dangerous people in the world don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're just a gaunt, quiet man walking down the hallway of a budget hotel, carrying a bundle of laundry, nodding hello as he passes you in the dark. The Cecil Hotel is still there today. It's been rebranded and renovated multiple times, but for those who know the history, the name doesn't matter. Whether it's the Night Stalker stalking the hallways, the grim sleeper hiding in the city's blind spots, or the tragic mystery of Elisa Lam, the story is always the same. It's a place where the light of Hollywood fades out and the true mysteries of the human heart begin. The Cecil Hotel is more than just a budget stay in downtown Los Angeles. It has long been linked to some of the city's most unsettling chapters. Over the years, it became known as a place where strange and troubling stories seem to gather. But those 2 names are only the tip of the iceberg. When you peel back the layers of the hotel's history, you realize the mystery did not begin in the 1980s, and it did not end on the rooftop. For decades, the Cecil was not just a place to stay. For many, it became a place to quietly disappear. From the 1930s through the 1960s, a troubling pattern began to form around the building at 640 South Main Street, giving it a reputation that would follow it for generations. This story does not begin in a dark alley or a police lab, but on a window ledge high above the streets of downtown Los Angeles. It is one of the most strange and heartbreaking moments in the Cecil Hotel's long history. A moment where one person's private struggle unexpectedly collided with another person's life in a way that feels almost impossible. This is the story of a 1962 Cecil double tragedy. Imagine the scene inside room 928. It is late in the evening on October 12th, 1962. The air in the room feels heavy, not from the California heat, but from everything that has been left unsaid. Sitting across from each other are Pauline Otten, a 27-year-old woman who looks completely worn down, and her estranged husband, Dewey. They are not there on a trip. This meeting at the Cecil Hotel is meant to be a last attempt to repair their marriage. They have been living apart, and this was supposed to be a chance to start over. But as the minutes pass, it becomes clear that things are not improving. Their quiet conversation slowly turns into a familiar argument, with old frustrations rising back to the surface. Eventually, Dewey realizes that nothing is going to be settled that night. Feeling overwhelmed, he decides to step out for a while to get some air and grab a meal. He puts on his jacket, tells Pauline he is heading out for dinner, and leaves the room. The door closes behind him, and the hotel room falls silent. Pauline is now alone. In the stillness of that small room, the weight of everything she is feeling seems to grow even heavier. She does not move around or make a sound. She simply sits there, staring at the window, lost in her thoughts. For her, the argument was no longer just about Dewey. It was about everything. About feeling stuck. About feeling left behind. After a while, she slowly walks over and opens the window. Far below, South Main Street is alive with movement. People are heading to late-night shows, meeting friends, or just passing through downtown Los Angeles. From that height, the city feels distant, almost unreal. What happens next unfolds in a matter of moments. At the same time, a man named George Giannini is walking along the sidewalk outside. He is 65 years old, a quiet man going about his evening, focused only on getting where he needs to go. He has no idea that his ordinary walk is about to become part of one of the most haunting stories in the Cecil Hotel's history. In an instant, two separate lives, with no connection at all, are about to cross in a way that no one could have imagined. In the quiet of room 928, Pauline Otten was no longer just looking out a window. To her, it felt like a way out. From a 9th floor, the view was classic 1960s downtown Los Angeles. Neon signs from nearby theaters glowed through the haze, and traffic moved slowly below. To anyone else, it was just another city scene. But to Pauline, that window felt like the only escape from the silence Dewey had left behind. She stood up from the edge of the bed. There was no frantic movement, no phone call, no note left behind. In many stories, people look for an explanation, something written down to explain what someone was feeling. Pauline left nothing like that. In that moment, she felt alone in a world that seemed to be moving on without her. She opened the window. The sounds of the city drifted in, distant voices, passing cars, the hum of downtown life. After a brief pause, she climbed onto the ledge and looked down at South Main Street far below. What happened next unfolded in just a few moments. At the same time, a 65-year-old man named George Giannini was walking along the sidewalk outside. He was a quiet local, the kind of person who blended into the crowd, thinking only about his own evening as he made his way down the street. George had no connection to Pauline and no idea what was happening above him. Two separate lives, completely unrelated, were about to cross in the most unexpected way. What followed shocked everyone who witnessed it and quickly became one of the most haunting moments in the Cecil Hotel's history. When people rushed toward the scene, they realized that two people had been involved in what looked like a single tragic event. By the time police sirens echoed through downtown Los Angeles, it was clear that this was not just one loss of life, but two. A private moment inside a hotel room had somehow turned into something that would be talked about for decades. Police sirens soon cut through the night, their red and blue lights reflecting off the old storefronts around the Cecil Hotel. When the first officers arrived, they were met by a crowd standing in stunned silence, all focused on the same spot on the sidewalk. At first glance, it looked like a single tragic incident involving two people. The way they were found, so close together, led investigators to briefly wonder if it might have been some kind of shared decision. In the early 1960s, Situations like that were not unheard of at the Cecil. So the first assumption, as uncomfortable as it was, seemed to make sense. But as officers began to look more closely, that explanation quickly started to fall apart. One of the men on the scene noticed something that did not fit. George Giannini, the older man, was still dressed as if he had simply been walking down the street. His shoes were on, his hands were in his coat pockets, and nothing about his position suggested he had been preparing for anything at all. When his identification was found, it became clear he did not live at the hotel. He had no room key, no connection to Pauline, and no reason to be there other than passing by. The two people had no link to each other. That was the moment investigators realized what had really happened. One person had been inside the hotel. The other had simply been outside at the wrong moment. Two separate lives had crossed in a way no one could have predicted. While this realization was setting in, another team went up to the 9th floor and entered room 928. The room was empty. The bed was still unmade, the window was open, and the curtains moved in the night air. Not long after, Dewey Otten was found nearby, walking back toward the hotel. When officers told him what had happened, he was completely overwhelmed. He explained that he and Pauline had argued and that he had stepped out for a short time, never imagining something like this could occur. In the end, 3 lives were changed in an instant. A woman facing a personal struggle, a husband hoping for another chance, and a stranger who was simply walking down the street. This is why the Cecil Hotel's past still unsettles people today. It is not just the events themselves, but how they seem to reach beyond the walls of the building, pulling in lives that had nothing to do with the hotel at all. The 1962 tragedy did not fade quietly into the past. It became part of the Cecil Hotel's identity, a moment that many detectives would later describe as one of the most unsettling cases they had ever encountered. What happened to Pauline Otten and George Giannini was no longer seen as just a sad coincidence. It was remembered as a warning that this building had a strange way of pulling unrelated lives into the same moment. From that point on, the Cecil was never again viewed as a normal downtown hotel. Something had shifted. The atmosphere inside felt heavier, as if the walls themselves carried the memory of what had happened. Even as the lobby was cleaned and guests came and went, the story lingered in the background. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the hotel's reputation began to change the kinds of people who stayed there. Families and business travelers slowly disappeared, replaced by those who were already struggling in one way or another. Locals in downtown Los Angeles began to treat the building with quiet caution. Some avoided walking directly past it. Others refused to look up at the windows, as if doing so invited something they did not want to think about. City officials even began questioning whether parts of the building were safe, simply because of how it was designed. This shift opened the door to an even darker chapter in the Cecil story. Within just a few years, the hotel was no longer associated only with personal tragedies. It became linked to serious crimes as well. One of the most well-known cases was the death of a woman known as Pigeon Goldie Osgood, a gentle figure who spent her days feeding birds in Pershing Square. She was found in her room at the Cecil, and her case was never solved. To many people, it felt like the hotel had crossed a line, moving from a place of misfortune into something far more troubling. Looking back, the story of Pauline Otten became a turning point. Her decision changed the course of several lives, including her husband's and a stranger's who had no connection to the hotel at all. From that moment forward, the Cecil stopped being just another building in downtown Los Angeles. It became a symbol of how quickly and unpredictably lives could be drawn into its history. When you follow the timeline from 1962 to later cases like the Night Stalker and eventually Elisa Lam, it becomes clear that this was the moment everything shifted. The Cecil did not suddenly become dark. It revealed what it was already becoming. The 1962 tragedy did not quietly disappear into history. It became one of those moments people in Los Angeles kept talking about, especially those who had seen the scene firsthand. For detectives who worked that night, the case of Pauline Otten and George Giannini became something they never forgot. It was no longer viewed as a simple personal tragedy. It felt like a strange warning that the Cecil Hotel was a place where unlikely events somehow found a way to happen. From that point forward, the Cecil was never quite the same. It lost its reputation as a glamorous downtown stay and took on a far heavier identity. There was a feeling that lingered in the building, as if the past was always close by. No matter how much the lobby was cleaned or the rooms were refreshed, the memory of what happened seemed to hang in the air. As the 1960s moved into the 1970s, the hotel's reputation began to change who stayed there. Families and business travelers slowly faded away, replaced by people who were dealing with serious struggles in their own lives. Locals in downtown Los Angeles started treating the building with quiet caution. Many avoided walking directly past it if they could, and some people even avoided looking up at the windows. City officials eventually took a closer look at the building itself, realizing that its design created risks that had never been fully considered before. This period marked the beginning of the most troubling chapter in the hotel's history. Over time, the Cecil became connected not just to personal despair, but to serious criminal cases as well. One of the most well-known was the death of a woman called Pigeon Goldie Osgood, a gentle figure who spent her days feeding birds in Pershing Square. She was found in her room at the Cecil, and the case was never solved. To many, it felt like the tragedy of 1962 had opened the door to something far darker. Looking back now, the legacy of Pauline Otten is about more than just one heartbreaking moment. Her story changed several lives, including her husband's and a stranger's who had no connection to the hotel at all. From that night on, the Cecil stopped being just another building in downtown Los Angeles. It became a place tied to a long chain of unsettling events. Looking back now, the legacy of Pauline Otten is about more than just one heartbreaking moment. Her story changed several lives, including her husband's and a stranger's who had no connection to the hotel at all. From that night on, the Cecil stopped being just another building in downtown Los Angeles. It became a place tied to a long chain of unsettling events. When you trace the timeline forward from Pauline to the Night Stalker and eventually to Elisa Lam, it becomes clear that 1962 was the turning point. That was the year the Cecil stopped being remembered as a landmark and started being remembered for the stories that would follow. In 1991, the lobby of the Cecil Hotel saw a guest check in who looked more like a high-end lawyer than someone staying in a budget hotel on Skid Row. He was confident, well-dressed, and spoke with a polished Austrian accent. But as the staff handed him his room key, they had no idea they were welcoming someone with a very dark past. This is the story of Jack Unterweger, a man who built a public image as a writer and intellectual while secretly living a double life. In 1974, the woods of Germany were the setting for a crime so disturbing it should have ended Jack Unterweger's story forever. A young woman was drawn into the forest, restrained with her own clothing, and lost her life in a way that revealed a deeply troubled and dangerous individual. Jack was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison in Austria. In most cases, that is where the story ends. But Jack Unterweger was not like most inmates. He had an extraordinary ability to charm and manipulate, and he was about to pull off one of the most shocking comebacks in criminal history. While sitting in his cell, Jack did not spend his time like most prisoners. He picked up a pen. He began writing poetry that critics called hauntingly beautiful, and plays that were praised for their depth and intelligence. His work began circulating far beyond the prison walls. He also wrote an autobiography called Purgatory, where he described a difficult childhood and a supposed personal transformation behind bars. He presented himself as someone who had been misunderstood and had now found purpose through art and reflection. This is where the story takes a truly unexpected turn. Influential writers, professors, and public figures across Austria began reading his work. They were impressed. Many of them believed that someone who could write with such insight could not possibly still be dangerous. A public campaign formed in his support. Fundraisers were held, petitions were signed, and television interviews were given. Jack was held up as an example of how rehabilitation through creativity could work. To his supporters, He became proof that people could change. And the pressure worked. In 1990, after serving just 15 years of a life sentence, Jack Unterweger was released from prison. And he did not walk back into a quiet, forgotten life. He stepped directly into the spotlight. News cameras were waiting for him at the prison gates. Supporters welcomed him as a success story. He was quickly hired as a television host and a journalist. He drove a white Mustang, wore tailored designer suits, and was seen at high-profile social events across Vienna. To the public, he was a symbol of personal transformation, the man who had turned his life around through writing and self-expression. But behind that polished image, something was deeply wrong. Within months of his release, women in Austria began going missing. Some were later found in remote wooded areas, connected by unsettling similarities. Investigators were confused, but no one suspected Jack. He was respected. He was visible. He was celebrated. In the eyes of many, he was no longer the person he used to be. Jack understood that to maintain his new public life while hiding his true nature, he needed a much larger stage, a place where he could blend in, a place that already had a reputation for darkness. So he pitched a story idea to his editors. He wanted to travel to Los Angeles to write about crime and life in Skid Row. He said he wanted to examine the failures of the American justice system. In the summer of 1991, Jack Unterweger boarded a flight to California. He brought his notebooks, his expensive luggage, and a restless energy that had never truly gone away. When he landed at LAX, he took a taxi and gave the driver the address of a building he had studied for months, a place already tied to one of the most infamous names in true crime history, the Cecil Hotel. Jack checked into a room on the upper floors and began to unpack. As he looked out at the neon-lit streets of Main Street below, he was no longer just a visitor. He was someone who believed he had finally found the perfect place to disappear into the background. The so-called intellectual had arrived, and the Cecil was about to gain 3 more names in its long, dark history. When Jack Unterweger checked into the Cecil Hotel in 1991, he didn't do it because it was cheap. He did it because he was drawn to dark places. He knew that just a few years earlier, Richard Ramirez had stayed in these same halls, slipping in and out without anyone paying attention. Jack wanted that same kind of invisibility. He wanted to be in a place where someone could walk past chaos and never be noticed. But Jack was not just there to hide. He was there to play a dangerous game. He contacted the LAPD, presenting himself as a well-known European journalist. He had the credentials, the charm, and that refined Austrian accent that made detectives of the early 1990s treat him with respect. He told them he was working on a social study about life in the toughest parts of Los Angeles. He said he wanted to understand the streets, the neighborhoods, and the people most of the world ignored. The LAPD agreed to let him observe from inside their patrol cars. Picture the scene. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. A black and white police car rolls through the roughest parts of Skid Row and Hollywood. 2 experienced officers sit in the front, alert and watching the streets. In the back seat, calm and well-dressed in a designer jacket, sits Jack Unterweger. To the officers, he was just a curious reporter. He was polite, always taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. But what they did not realize was that Jack was not gathering information for a story. He was carefully studying their routines. He asked things like, when someone is found in these alleys, how long does it usually take before anyone notices? Or, if someone goes missing from this block, how quickly do you start looking for them? He even asked about how investigations worked in places that were busy and overcrowded. Without realizing it, the police were showing him where attention was weakest. They talked about which streets were rarely checked, which alleys were poorly lit, and how certain areas received less focus than others. Jack was quietly learning how the city worked. After the ride along ended, he would return to his room at the Cecil. He would sit in the dim light, looking out over the streets he had just mapped out in his mind. By day, he was the polished intellectual, meeting city officials and speaking with activists. But after dark, something changed. He would leave the hotel quietly, moving through the lobby without drawing attention. He did not need directions. He already knew exactly where he was going. He began approaching women in the very areas the police had described as low priority. He understood that in a city as large and chaotic as Los Angeles, people could disappear without immediately raising alarm. Before long, news reports began to surface. Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, Sherry Long. Their names appeared in the papers after they were found in out-of-the-way locations on the edges of the city. Investigators noticed strange similarities in these cases, but at first, they could not connect the dots. All the while, Jack was back at the Cecil. He would read the morning newspaper in the hotel cafe, quietly following the stories while the city searched for answers. To everyone else, he was the journalist who came to study crime in Los Angeles. In reality, he was much closer to the story than anyone realized. While Jack Unterweger was back at the Cecil Hotel, likely standing on his balcony and looking out over the city, he was quietly spreading fear across. A very different kind of storm was building thousands of miles away in Vienna. In Austria, local investigators were starting to experience what felt like a system-wide warning. Since Jack had been released from prison, the number of women going missing had sharply increased. These were not random cases. When some were eventually discovered, they were found in wooded areas, unclothed, and taken in a way that showed clear signs of force. But there was a serious obstacle. Jack Unterweger had become a national symbol. He was the man who was supposed to prove that people could change. To accuse him meant admitting that the country's intellectual elite had been completely misled. Still, a small group of determined detectives in Vienna quietly started their own investigation. They built a detailed timeline. They tracked every book tour, every television appearance, and every public trip Jack made, then compared it to the dates women disappeared. What they found was deeply unsettling. Almost every time Jack appeared in a new city for a reading or lecture, another woman vanished soon after. But suspicion alone was not enough. They needed proof that what was happening in Europe was connected to what was now happening in America. Back in Los Angeles, the LAPD was facing a growing problem of its own. The cases of Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, and Sherry Long were now being examined as part of one larger pattern. Investigators studied the way these women had been restrained and noticed something unusual. The knots were complex and carefully made, nothing like what they normally saw on the streets. Whoever was responsible had a very specific skill set. It was a signature left behind on purpose. This was long before fast online systems and instant global databases. The connection happened almost by chance. Austrian police contacted Interpol, asking if any other major city had recorded cases involving a unique restraint pattern using clothing and intricate knots. When that message reached Los Angeles, the room went silent. The same officers who had taken Jack Unterweger on ride-alongs suddenly felt uneasy. They remembered the charming Austrian man sitting in the back seat. They remembered how he kept asking about response times, missing persons, and how evidence was handled. They finally realized he had not been gathering material for a story. He had been gathering information for something far more dangerous. The LAPD and Austrian authorities quietly formed a joint task force. They did not move in right away. Jack was still a public figure, and one mistake would allow him to turn the media against them and slip away. So instead, they watched him. They monitored him walking through the Cecil Hotel lobby. They tracked his mail. They observed how he moved through the same neighborhoods he had been studying. But Jack had spent years behind bars, and he knew what it felt like when attention shifted. He sensed that something had changed. He knew the protection the Cecil once gave him was starting to fade. Then one morning, without checking out and without saying a word to the staff, Jack Unterweger disappeared from the Cecil Hotel. The man who had fooled 2 continents was now a fugitive, and what followed was a high-stakes chase across the United States that would end not with applause, but with final accountability. When Jack Unterweger realized the LAPD and the Austrian authorities were finally talking to each other, he didn't panic, he performed. He was a man who had spent his entire life playing a role, and now he was moving into the final act of his own twisted screenplay. He slipped out of the Cecil Hotel like a ghost, leaving behind the dust of Skid Row. He didn't take his designer suits or his heavy notebooks. He took his ego and his girlfriend a young Austrian woman who believed he was an innocent victim of a global conspiracy. Together, they disappeared into the vast expanse of the American highway system, triggering one of the most sophisticated international manhunts of the 1990s. Jack didn't hide in a basement or under a bridge. That wasn't his style. Instead, he led the FBI and Interpol on a multi-state chase that felt like a psychological thriller. While moving from city to city, checking into motels under false names, he was doing something incredibly bold. He was calling the media. While on the run, Jack used payphones at gas stations and rest stops to contact Austrian newspapers and television stations. He told them he was being framed by the LAPD and that the American police were trying to hide their own failures by blaming a famous European intellectual. He was trying to use his celebrity status as a shield against the charges, and for a short time, it worked. He convinced many people in Austria that he was being hunted by a system that did not understand his art. Meanwhile, the FBI was tracking his credit card activity and his phone calls with extreme precision. They realized he was moving through the southeastern United States, heading toward the coast. The so-called intellectual killer was trying to reach a place where he could blend into the international tourist crowd and eventually make his way back to Europe. In February 1992, the chase came to an abrupt end in Miami, Florida. The FBI narrowed his location to a specific area in South Beach. This was not the gritty world of the Cecil Hotel. This was neon lights, palm trees, and ocean air. When federal agents finally closed in, they did not find a terrifying figure. They found a man who looked like he was on vacation, wearing shorts and a bright shirt, looking every bit like a relaxed traveler. But when the handcuffs went on, the charm faded and the cold, calculating figure underneath was all that remained. The trial in Austria became a massive media spectacle that lasted for months. The prosecution brought in the LAPD detectives he had deceived, forensic specialists who study the knots, and the families of victims from both Europe and the United States. They showed that Jack was a transatlantic serial offender, a man who acted for power and wrote for attention. On June 29, 1994, the jury delivered its decision. Guilty on 9 counts. Jack was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. The so-called rehabilitated icon was sent back behind bars, the place he had worked so hard to escape. But Jack had one last statement to make. He had always said he would never spend the rest of his life locked in a cell. That same night, only hours after the verdict, guards found Jack Unterweger in his cell. He had taken a drawstring from his prison clothing and tied it into a complex, decorative knot, the same type he had used in the crimes in Los Angeles and Vienna. He used that knot to end his own life. In doing so, he left behind his final admission. The knot was his signature, his proof, and his last attempt at control. He became part of the Cecil Hotel's dark history as one of its most calculated predators, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous presence is not a legend or a rumor, but the charming guest in the white suit who spoke with police before committing his crimes. That brings the story of Jack Unterweger and his time at the Cecil Hotel to a close. Since you have now covered the hotel's most infamous figures, you can either connect these stories into one final master history of the Cecil, or move on to an entirely new mystery. The legacy of Jack Unterweger's time at the Cecil Hotel is not just about the 3 lives lost in Los Angeles. It is about how easily a place like that can hide someone who knows how to blend it. When news of his death broke in 1994, the staff at the Cecil were left with a familiar chill. Once again, a predator had walked their hallways unnoticed. Jack had not just stayed there. He had used the hotel as cover, proving that charm, confidence, and a clean suit could be as effective as any disguise. Where most people were chaotic or careless, Unterweger was smooth and calculated. He found safety behind the same brick walls that had witnessed decades of tragedy. His case changed how the Cecil was seen. It was no longer just a place of misfortune or desperation. It became known as a place where something darker could take root and grow. The fact that Jack had planned his LAPD ride-alongs from a room inside the hotel only deepened that stain. By the end of the 1990s, the Cecil was not just a cheap hotel. It was a true crime landmark, a building with a memory. Even now, Jack Unterweger's shadow lingers there. He represents the hotel's most disturbing truth. The darkness was not just in the broken or desperate. It could wear a smile, speak politely, and shake your hand. His story became the final bridge between the Cecil's violent past and its modern reputation. The hotel tried to change its name and repaint its image, but history does not come off that easily. From the jumpers of the 1930s to killers like Unterweger, the Cecil earned its place in the darkest chapter of Los Angeles. He was just one more man who found exactly what he needed there, a place that let him be who he really was. While the names Ramirez and Unterweger get most of the attention today, they were only the latest figures in a building that had already seen decades of tragedy. To understand the Cecil, you have to go back to the time when it earned its most unsettling nickname, the Suicide. From the 1930s through the 1970s, the hotel did not just host guests. It became a place that seemed to pull in people who were already struggling, as if the building itself carried a heavy, inescapable weight. In the early 1930s, the Cecil Hotel was a place filled with promise and polished ambition. It had been built to become the pride of downtown Los Angeles, a place where powerful business figures and rising Hollywood stars would gather beneath its grand ceilings. But on a Tuesday evening in 1931, that polished image quietly began to fall apart. A man stepped through the heavy front doors carrying a private burden he had no intention of taking back with him. He walked to the front desk, straightened his hat, and signed a guest book as James Willis from Chicago. To the clerk, he looked like any ordinary traveler hoping for a fresh start in California. He paid for the room, took his brass key, and headed upstairs. But James Willis was not his real name. The man was actually W.K. Norton, and he had not come to the Cecil to begin something new. He had come to quietly bring something to an end. Norton rode the elevator to his room, catching his reflection in the polished walls, likely knowing it would be the last time he would see himself that way. Once inside, he did not unpack. He did not call for anything. He simply sat alone in a room meant for rest, a space that quickly became the setting for his final moments. In his pocket were several poison capsules, a silent way out from a life he no longer wished to continue. Even in those early years, the Cecil made it easy to disappear. Norton took the capsules and lay down. There was no noise, no disturbance in the hallway, no sign of what was happening behind the closed door. Outside, the city carried on as usual. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, and life moved forward just a few steps away. It was not until a maid knocked the following morning that the truth came to light. When police searched the room, they found identification that revealed who he really was. W.K. Norton had checked in under a false name, almost as if he understood that this hotel was the perfect place to quietly vanish. He became the first recorded person to lose their life inside the Cecil Hotel. In a way, he opened a ledger that would continue to grow for decades. But what followed was just as unsettling. Once the authorities removed his body, the hotel staff moved in. They cleaned the room, changed the sheets, and aired out the space. Within hours, any trace of what had happened was gone. By that same evening, a new guest checked into the very room, unaware of what had taken place there only hours earlier, and went to sleep. That moment set a haunting pattern for the Cecil. It showed how someone could arrive as a person and quietly leave as a number, while the hotel simply reset for the next visitor. It marked the beginning of a long cycle of anonymity and sorrow that would one day include names like Richard Ramirez, Jack Unterweger, and Elisa Lam. W.K. Norton did not just leave a room behind. He left a signal to anyone who was struggling that this was a place where the outside world would not look too closely at what happened behind closed doors. By 1932, the shadow of the Great Depression had stretched across the United States, and Los Angeles was feeling the pressure. The Cecil Hotel, which had opened with such fanfare just a few years earlier, was seeing its identity shift. Those high, vaulted ceilings and the costly marble floors that once felt like a symbol of the roaring 20s began to feel cold. The echoes in the lobby weren't of laughter anymore. They were the sounds of desperate people searching for a place to hide from a world that had run out of money and hope. Into this environment walked a 25-year-old man named Benjamin Doddick. Benjamin wasn't a drifter or a hardened criminal. He was young, in the prime of his life, and by all accounts, he should have been looking toward the future. But when he approached the front desk of the Cecil, he wasn't carrying much luggage, and he wasn't looking for a long-term stay. He checked in, took his key, and rode the elevator to one of the upper floors. What happened inside that room over the next few hours is completely unknown because, as police would later note, there was no disturbance. No one in neighboring rooms heard a shout. No one heard a struggle. It was as if Benjamin had stepped out of the world the moment he closed that heavy wooden door. When checkout time came and passed the following morning, the hotel staff didn't think much of it first. People overslept all the time. But by the afternoon, a maid made her rounds. She knocked. No answer. She called out. Silence. Finally, she took her heavy iron skeleton key, slotted it into the lock, and pushed the door open. What she saw stayed with her for the rest of her life. Benjamin Doddick was slumped over, the victim of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. But here's the detail that truly unsettles those who study the Cecil. When investigators arrived and began searching the room for a reason, they found nothing. There was no manifesto, no tear-stained letter to a lost love, no explanation for why a 25-year-old would end his life in a $2 a night hotel room. He hadn't left a message for the world. He had simply left the world. This case marked a turning point. If W.K. Norton's death the year before was shocking, Benjamin Doddick's death was the start of a pattern. Local newspapers began to notice a strange, localized phenomenon. People weren't just dying at the Cecil. They were coming to the Cecil to die. It was as if the building itself emitted a frequency that only the brokenhearted and desperate could sense. The energy of the hotel shifted. Staff began to view guests differently when they checked in alone with no luggage. The marble lobby, once a place of prestige, began to feel like a waiting room for the end. Benjamin didn't leave a note, but he left a void the building seemed to absorb. He became part of the foundation of what we now call the Cecil curse. The notion that once you enter those doors carrying a heavy burden, the hotel doesn't help you bear it. It drags you down. Benjamin Doddick was the first of many young people who came to the Cecil seeking the silence that the busy streets of Los Angeles couldn't provide. And as the 1930s continued, that silence would soon be shattered by an even more violent sequence of events. By 1934, the Cecil Hotel was no longer just a building. It was becoming a character in a dark play. The staff had grown a thick skin, but nothing could have prepared them for the arrival of Sergeant Louis D. Borden. Louis wasn't a drifter, and he wasn't a victim of the Depression's financial collapse. He was a retired Army sergeant, a man whose life had been defined by discipline, structure, and the mental toughness forged from years of military service. He was the last person anyone expected to appear on the permanent guest list. But as anyone familiar with the Cecil's history will tell you, the hotel doesn't care about rank. On a warm July afternoon, Borden walked into the lobby, posture straight, movements methodical. He checked in, went to his room, and for several days was the perfect guest. Quiet, tidy, and causing no trouble. But inside that room, a different kind of battle was unfolding. One his military training hadn't prepared him for. When the hotel staff eventually entered his room after he didn't respond to a wake-up call, they found a scene far more visceral than the quiet passing of W.K. Norton. Sergeant Borden was in his bed, having used a standard shaving razor to end his life. The room, which had been a place of rest just hours before, was now a testament to a despair that was jagged and sharp. Unlike Benjamin Doddick, Borden left notes. Several, carefully written and placed where they could be discovered. Yet, as detectives read them, they didn't reveal a clear reason for his decision. The notes didn't mention gambling debts or a scandal. Instead, they spoke of a deep, unshakable darkness, a feeling of exhaustion with the march of time. What makes the Borden case so haunting is the psychological profile. This was a man who had survived the horrors of war, who had faced death on the battlefield and survived. Yet, within the four walls of a $2 a night room at the Cecil, something inside him finally broke. It's as if the building provided a unique kind of isolation a quiet room, where the thoughts you've been avoiding finally catch up to you. The local papers began to notice a trend. Headlines didn't just report the deaths. They framed the Cecil as a suicide trap. The building was gaining a reputation as a place where the veil was thin. People whispered that if you were already carrying the weight of the world, the Cecil wouldn't just host you. It would pull you toward the finish line. Police became familiar presences in the lobby. The James Willis case, the Dada case, and now the Borden case, all within a few short years. The hotel was barely a decade old, yet its body count rivaled some of the city's oldest hospitals. Lewis Borden's death proved the curse or darkness of the Cecil wasn't just targeting the young or the weak. It could dismantle even the most disciplined minds. Staff began to dread the 9th floor, where many tragedies seemed to cluster. Little did they know, the 1930s were about to close with a tragedy that would move from the privacy of the rooms to the very public sidewalk below. By 1937, the Cecil Hotel had been open for just over a decade, but it had already aged a lifetime. The staff had become grim experts in the signs of a permanent guest. They knew the look of someone who wasn't planning on checking out, and they knew the protocol for when the police arrived. But up until this point, the tragedies had stayed behind closed doors. They were private, quiet affairs that happened in the dark. That all changed on a cold night in March with the arrival of Grace Magro. Grace was staying on the 9th floor. At this height, the Cecil feels like it's looming over the rest of the city. When you look out those windows, the street below is a distant world of moving lights and tiny people. For Grace, that distance wasn't a comfort, it was a destination. In the early hours of the morning, while the rest of the hotel was thick with sleep, Grace Magro climbed onto the ledge of her window. We don't know if she hesitated. We don't know if she looked back at the room one last time. All we know is that she stepped into the air. But the Cecil has a way of making even the quickest exit complicated. As Grace fell from a 9th floor, she didn't have a clear path to the pavement. Stretching across the alleyway and the side of the building was a chaotic web of heavy-duty telephone and power wires. It was the 1930s, and the city's infrastructure was draped across the streets like a messy net. In a moment that seems like something out of a horror movie, Grace's body became violently entangled in those wires. The lines didn't snap, and they didn't catch her safely. Instead, they snagged her, leaving her suspended in midair, hundreds of volts of electricity humming through the lines around her. When the sun began to rise over downtown LA, the early morning workers didn't find a body on the sidewalk. They looked up and saw the silhouette of a woman hanging from the wires, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. It was a gruesome public spectacle that paralyzed the block. The police and the fire department had to be called in to perform a task they had never anticipated, retrieving a jumper from the sky. The recovery process took hours, and by the time they brought Grace down, a massive crowd had gathered. The secret was out. The Cecil wasn't just a place where people disappeared. It was a place that put its tragedies on display. This event did something to the psychology of the neighborhood. It turned the Cecil from a troubled building into a monument of misfortune. People started to associate the very exterior of the hotel with death. You couldn't walk past South Main Street without glancing up, half expecting to see another shadow falling from the 9th floor. The investigation into Grace's life yielded the same frustrating results as the others. There was no clear motive, no smoking gun. It was as if the 9th floor had simply exerted its own gravity. Grace Magro became the first of the Cecil jumpers, a category of death that would eventually claim the lives of Pauline Otten and George Giannini decades later. The 1930s ended with the Cecil Hotel standing as a vertical graveyard. The management tried to paint over the scandal, but the building had already earned its reputation. It had become a beacon. It was telling the world that if you had reached the end of your rope, there was a room waiting for you on the 9th floor. By 1944, the Cecil Hotel had spent over a decade absorbing the sorrows of the Great Depression and the early years of World War II. The staff had witnessed nearly every type of tragedy, the poisonings, the slashings, the jumpers. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what would unfold in room 657. This is the story of Dorothy Jean Purcell, and it stands as one of the darkest chapters in the hotel's long, blood-stained history. Dorothy was only 19 years old. She had checked into the hotel with her 38-year-old boyfriend, a shoe salesman named Ben Levine. They weren't there for anything sinister. They were just two people seeking a place to stay. But Dorothy carried a secret she hadn't fully confronted. Even with herself, she was pregnant, and she was in deep denial about it. In the middle of the night, while Ben slept just a few feet away, Dorothy began experiencing sharp, agonizing pains in her abdomen. She didn't wake Ben. She didn't call the front desk or summon a doctor. In a state of complete shock, and perhaps a dissociative break from reality, she crawled into the communal bathroom on the floor. There, alone under the dim flicker of a single bulb, she gave birth to a baby boy. What came next is the stuff of nightmares. Dorothy later claimed she looked at the infant and believed he was dead. She said he wasn't breathing, wasn't moving, in a moment of pure panic, driven by fear, trauma, and the terror of scandal. She walked over to the bathroom window and opened it. She didn't check for a pulse. She didn't wrap him in a towel. She simply let the newborn fall into the narrow, dark alley below. Then she returned to her room, cleaned herself up, and crawled back into bed beside Ben. She said nothing. She acted as if the previous hour had never occurred, as if the walls of the Cecil could absorb the secret the way they had absorbed so many others. But the Cecil doesn't hide secrets. It only waits for them to be discovered. The next morning, a guest in a nearby building looked down into the alley and spotted a small, white figure lying on the roof of a lower structure. When the police arrived, they recovered the newborn. The coroner's report delivered the most devastating revelation. The baby had been alive at birth. His lungs had functioned. He only died upon impact. The trail of evidence quickly led back to Dorothy Purcell. She was arrested and charged with murder, but her trial shocked the public. Her defense argued she had suffered from puerperal psychosis, a severe mental break triggered by the trauma of childbirth. She was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a psychiatric hospital. This case cemented the Cecil's reputation as a hotel unlike any other. It proved that the building could warp even the most fundamental human instincts, like the drive to protect a child, into something horrifying. The Cecil was no longer simply a place where adults ended their own lives. It had become a place where life itself could be snatched away before it even began. From the 1930s to the 1970s, the Cecil Hotel became a vertical record of despair. Whether it was the poison of W.K. Norton, the razor of Sergeant Borden, or the window of Dorothy Purcell, the building magnified suffering. By the 1980s, it had already absorbed decades of tragedy. Today, the Cecil still stands. Its lobby is open, the high ceilings are intact, and the marble floors shine, but the silence lingers. The hotel has been renovated, rebranded, and now operates with new management. But the stories, the shadows, and the echoes of the past remain woven into its walls. Guests walk through a building that is both a functioning hotel and a living reminder of the lives that once passed through it. The Cecil is no longer just a structure. It's a testament to a history that refuses to be forgotten.
Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story. Make sure to subscribe.